Phillip, and I'm a grateful believer in Jesus Christ who has overcome alcoholism and many other addictions, and I would like to share a little of my story. Well, to start things off, let's go back to 1986. Life was not very welcoming. I was born into a very chaotic and broken life. My mother was basically a gypsy, never staying in one place too long, and along her travels, she would leave behind children. Oddly enough, it was always a boy and a girl pair. And there were a total of 6 of us. We were all left in different states. And my story begins in Lexington, moving place to place, living with different people, drugs, alcohol, abuse. That was a normal thing. My siblings and I were used to make child pornography and physically abused. I could go on and on about how bad the abuse was, but suffice to say it was really bad. Eventually, my sister and I were abandoned in an apartment for 3 days. And my 18-month-old sister and I were finally rescued by a Crimes Against Children unit and placed in foster care. I received plenty of love, which was something that was foreign to me at this point. The years went on and I tried to blend in. Sure, there were some hard times, but all in all, things were pretty good. When I was about 11, my mom was in a horrible car accident, and she fractured her neck and was unable to care for my brothers and I. And my dad, of course, he was there, but he had to work all the time. And we were fortunate enough to be able to afford a nanny who came in and helped take care of things and helped with my brothers in the house and things like that. But around this time is when I really began to act out. And my parents couldn't handle it. They didn't know how to. My mom was in bed, and so I ended up going to boarding school. And that's when I really began to act out and get wild. I was kicked out of 3 different boarding schools over the course of 4 years. I won't go into all the detail about the horrible things that I did, but I will say this about the schools. They were for children who were on their way to jail or on their way out of jail. And I always made friends with the worst of the worst. After the 3rd school, I made a deal with my parents to follow their rules and come live at home again. The only reason they agreed to it was because they found out about the abuse that was going on with the kids at this 3rd boarding school that I was at. And I was 16 when I moved back home. And 2 weeks after I turned 18, I was thrown out for breaking that contract. And I was really stubborn. I remember thinking to myself, you know what, I can do this without them. I don't need them. I can make a way. And 2 weeks later, I began to sell drugs and drop out of high school. After that, I was kicked out of several friends' houses for various reasons and also kicked out of a homeless shelter. At this point, I thought, well, this is rock bottom. But instead of trying to work my way out of it, I just kept digging to see how deep I could get. And I slept on the streets for a while. I've slept pretty much anywhere you can think of. I even used to take frequent naps on a public toilet at a bus station. At one point, these people let me stay in a tent in their backyard on one of the worst streets in Middletown, Ohio. I was grateful at the time because at least I had some kind of shelter. Life was hard, but I didn't want to give up drinking and drugs. I thought, I'm not an addict because I don't do the hard stuff like crack and heroin. So I continued to survive on the streets in Middletown, right there in the ghetto. Finally, I was able to get government housing, and I was at least off the streets. But all that really did was free up time for me to get in more trouble and be involved in more criminal activities that I previously wasn't. And one night, I was all alone in my apartment, and I became very depressed. I had never felt so alone in the I had never felt so alone in the world. I felt as that I had no one and no one cared about me. And so I ended up taking an entire bottle of prescription of resveratrol, somewhere between 60 and 90 tablets. Within a short amount of time, I was laying on the floor, holding my stomach and rolling around. screaming and crying, begging God to let me die. And I heard a voice say, "I'm not done with you." And I passed out. Woke up the next morning like nothing had happened. I was perfectly fine. And so I thought to myself, well, I'm not allowed to die yet. So that was the last time I ever knowingly tried to kill myself. I met this guy who became a buddy of mine, and we hung out quite a bit. One morning, his girlfriend showed up at my apartment wanting to buy some weed for him, and she asked to come in. We talked for a bit, and she went on to explain that she was breaking up with him, and she had feelings for me. Well, being who I was, I just went with it. And of course, that led to an altercation between my friend and I. And then after that, Christina and I moved in together. And things were good for a while. I kept partying and selling drugs, and I thought life was good at this point. And then I became a father. And I didn't fully understand what it meant to be a father until I was standing in the hospital holding Jaden. And I just remember looking at him thinking, I gotta change. I can't raise a child in this environment. And so I immediately went home, got all my paraphernalia, all my drugs, and I threw them away. And I knew that I needed to be a better person. I still continued to drink and do drugs. I just wasn't a dealer anymore, and I thought that was good enough. For a while, things were great, but as time went on, I realized that I did not mesh with Jaden's mother, and something had to change. And about this time, my parents showed up at my house, which was a huge shock for me because over the last 3 years, I had only maybe spoke or seen them a handful of times. And I never ever told them where I lived. They ended up hiring a private detective to find me. And they were accepting of Jaden and his mom, but I quickly saw this as an opportunity to get out of my dead relationship. So Jaden and I moved back in with my parents, and I lived with my parents a few years, and during that time, I was really, really trying to get my life back together. I went back to high school, I got my diploma, I went to heating and air conditioning school, I took cram courses to get my real estate license, I even went to community college for a semester to get my basic courses out of the way for psychology, because I wanted to be a therapist to help others through hard times, since I thought this was the end of my hard journey. But I still wouldn't give up the alcohol. And, where'd I go? But I still wouldn't give up the alcohol. My parents ended up kicking Jaden and I out, and I ended up working a couple jobs doing painting, maintenance, server at a restaurant. And then I had an opportunity in Lexington to work for my family taking care of rental properties. And that gave me a chance to start up my own handyman company. And again, I thought things were great. But on January 12th, 2012, I got a DUI. This was the first time in my life I had ever been arrested. My family was very disappointed in me. Between the DUI and sleeping with one of their tenants, I was no longer allowed to work on any of their properties. I'm sorry, can I get a tissue? My nose is running. I wasn't allowed to work on any of their properties anymore. Around this time was when I met my ex-wife. I really liked her, but I wasn't sure if she was the one I wanted to marry. But she had a stable career, and my family kept telling me I should marry her and that she was out of my league and I was lucky to have found her. So I figured I'll marry her and I will learn to love her. And I did for a while, I thought I loved her. But as our marriage went on, my drinking got worse and worse. I became very unhappy with my marriage. But I believed that no matter what, there was always a way to work things out, and that marriage was a vow that was not meant to be broken. So I decided to stop drinking. I knew that alcohol was clouding my judgment, and I needed to see things clearly to make a decision like this. After several months of not drinking at all, I was even more unhappy with my marriage, and I could see things were not going well. One day I received a call that changed my life. It cut me deep. The children's doctor's office called me by mistake to let my wife know they had scheduled an appointment for her 12-year-old daughter at a transgender clinic. And I was devastated. I asked my wife about it, and she confirmed and then asked that I start addressing her daughter by male pronouns. I didn't know what to do, but I knew that it was wrong and it was very distasteful to me. So I tried everything, counseling, talking, discussing the Bible, but to no avail. Things got worse. I was made fun of by my wife and her daughters. I was even asked to wear a dress and pose for a drag queen calendar, and when I refused, the ridicule continued. I finally decided I needed to get back in church and had no more tricks up my sleeve. My intelligence wasn't enough. My patience wasn't enough. I wasn't enough. I needed God. I came to church on the rock, and from the first time I walked in the door, I felt at home. I felt like I could rest, even if it were only for a couple hours at a time. I finally filed for divorce, and then things got even harder. Not only was I constantly being goaded by my ex and her daughters, they began messing with Jaden as well. I continued to go to church, and I began going to Celebrate Recovery. As often as I could get in the doors of the church, I was there. One morning, I received an unexpected phone call from my friend's mother. She called to let me know that her son had passed in his sleep. I couldn't believe it. He was only 42. I loved this man and his family.
Yeah.
But because everything that was going on in my home at the time, I was unable to attend his funeral, which really hurt. And but I pressed that much harder into God because I didn't know what else to do. At this point, suicide encompassed most of my thoughts every day from the time I woke up to the time I passed out from exhaustion. I thought, how can things get any worse? Well, they did. Shortly after that, my grandmother, who I was closer with than anybody in my family, began declining, and the doctors told us she had 2 weeks. So I left my family for 2 weeks to help take care and spend time with my grandmother before she passed. It was hard, but by this point, my feelings had gone numb and I couldn't cry anymore. I cried so much that when I did cry, no tears would flow. I was so broken. But I knew that if I kept chasing God, He would see me through. Finally, I got a little bit of a break, or so I thought. My ex-wife and her daughters moved out, and that gave me a little peace, but then I began to have other problems. I had so many problems on my farm, I began to hate it. But I didn't want to give it up. I kept saying, I'll fight tooth and nail for this place. One day I went out to take care of my animals and noticed that one of my dogs were missing. I didn't think too much of it at first. I just thought it was weird that only one of them was missing. Maybe she was out chasing something. After about a week of her missing, I found part of her skeleton, and that was it. I went out to one of my fields and I laid face down in the grass and I cried to God, telling Him I couldn't bear any more loss. I begged God for a rest. And that day, God poured out love and peace into me.
Thank you, Lord.
And for the rest of the day, I had no worries, no thoughts of suicide. I was finally able to rest. The next day, I was back to all my worries, but I was able to keep pushing forward because I got some rest. I was living one day at a time. It was all I could handle. If I knew I could just make it to the end of this day, it would be okay. And I kept living like that until my divorce was finally over. The farm was sold, and I moved to Ohio into my grandmother's house. While I was up there, I helped my parents to fix it up. I helped set up their farm for raising some chickens and things like that. And this was not ideal for me, since it meant I didn't get to see my kids very often. So I decided that the year 2023 was my year to heal physically, mentally, and spiritually. it was bittersweet. I had made leaps and bounds on healing all the way around, but I still missed my kids and began to remember why I originally moved so far away from my family all those years ago. Thank you. So I packed my things up and moved back to Kentucky before things got bad with my family. I always had my best relationships with them when I was apart from them. So I wanted to maintain that. Now that I'm back in Kentucky, God has done such amazing things in my life. He has continued to amaze me and keep me laughing. I am now in contact with all my biological siblings and proud to say that even though our journeys were different and separated, we all found God.
Amen.
Right.
And are doing our best to be better than our parents were. I can't wait to see what adventures God has planned for me next.